Before the Lord ascended, he gave his great commission to go and make disciples of all nations, beginning a new dispensation that some call the church age, or the age of reconciliation, the time when the nations that were divided up and disinherited during the Tower of Babel incident are reclaimed into the kingdom of God. When asked what will be the sign of his coming, Jesus said, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. The end of the age of reconciliation will be signaled by a testimony of the gospel to all people groups." Moreover, his coming again, this time in glory, is contingent upon the petition of Jerusalem. "You will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" However, the descendants of Jacob are blinded from their Messiah until the criteria of the age of reconciliation is satisfied. Paul says that a partial hardening has come to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. The fullness of the Gentiles is the desired effect of the gospel being preached to all nations, until which time the blindness remains in effect, which in turn delays the return of Christ. Dr. Oz presents the case that it is the day of the Lord and our gathering together to him that is being restrained in 2 Thessalonians, not the man of sin. The Lord is restrained by the gospel being preached to all nations, and God is personally restraining the Messiah by blinding Israel from being able to petition him. In his sovereignty, God withholds the revelation of the Messiah from Israel so as to buy more time for the Great Commission to do its work. God's blinding of Israel effectively staves off the eschaton. Having gained some biblical intel, we can ask ourselves some timely questions. Is there any indication that the blindness of Israel is lifting? Can we consider the criteria of the fullness of Gentiles to be satisfied? In answering these questions, we gain insight into humanity's proximity to the return of the Lord. Sev Porat, a messianic evangelist in Israel, thinks that the process has begun, that we are in the fullness of the Gentiles right now. He understands the relationship between the fullness and the blindness to be an inverse one, whereby the blindness progressively lifts as the Gentiles not just believe in their Messiah, but also support Israel as a political entity. However, Joel Richardson would disagree with Porat's assessment. Richardson places the fullness of the Gentiles and the salvation of Israel in an end-time chain of events. The grammar of Romans 11:25 supports Richardson's view instead of Porat's. It demonstrates the contingent nature of the fullness of the Gentiles coming in before the blindness can be lifted. Once that is achieved, then the salvation of all Israel will quickly unfold, concomitant with the return of Christ, as Paul demonstrates by going on to quote Isaiah 59:20. So what is a nation? It is telling that God takes an entire chapter of Genesis to list all the nations that were known in the ancient Semitic worldview. It indicates that the nations cannot be regarded homogeneously, but that each individual nation represents a portion of God's family that has been lost. Therefore, the time of the fullness of the Gentiles should be understood as the moment when representatives from every people, nation, and tongue populate the olive tree. The Joshua Project and the International Mission Board have similar understandings for the definition of a nation. The IMB identifies language as the primary and dominant identifying factor of a people group. Of course, there are other factors involved which may further divide a people group despite speaking the same language. The Joshua Project estimates approximately 41% of the world's people groups are unreached, meaning they have less than 2% evangelical Christians and less than 5% simple Christian adherents. And according to the International Mission Board, approximately 30% of the world's people groups are not even engaged, meaning they have a church planning strategy consistent with the evangelical faith and practice underway. According to these statistics, we can by no means be satisfied that the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Notice again that the fullness of the Gentiles is not measured by population. The quality that is filling the olive tree is the nations, not numbers of non-Jews. By which criteria, the fullness could be satisfied regardless of how many ethnicities actually believe. No, the Great Commission is to the ends of the earth. The gospel of the kingdom is to be preached as a witness to all nations. To reiterate, Romans 11:26 describes all Israel being saved. and rather suddenly when or once the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. It is not a matter of as the fullness of the Gentiles approaches, the blindness begins to lift. Therefore, any resistance to the gospel amongst the Jews today indicates that the blindness is still in place as much as it has ever been. The existence of anti-missionary organizations like Jews for Judaism is just as much an indicator of Israel's blindness as Messianics, Jews for Jesus, are supposedly of its being lifted. The text is clear that all Israel will be saved. Moreover, other scriptures indicate that her salvation will occur in the eschatological time of tribulation. They are delivered out of great tribulation, which coincides with the resurrection. The resurrection occurs at the return of Christ, who comes quickly once he is petitioned by Jerusalem, until which time Israel is blinded in order to reclaim the nations back into God's kingdom. Therefore, the fullness of the Gentiles and the blindness of Israel should be monitored to gauge our proximity to the end. The time of the fullness of the Gentiles is still yet future, which ensures that the blindness of Israel remains in effect. We should take heart, however, seeing as the gospel has never reached as far as it has in our modern times, indicating that we are accelerating towards the fulfillment of the sign of the end. We should continue to monitor the extent of the gospel to the nations to gauge our proximity to that end, as well as the conversion rates of Jews the world over in order to gauge where the fullness of the Gentiles actually is.